Good evening. How are you all doing today? It's good to see our beautiful campus and our students here today, and our teachers and faculty and our distinguished guests. I'd like to thank you for coming to our Black History program that we're doing today with Dr. George C. Wright. There we go. As you know, this is Black History Month, and this is a very important month because we recognize the culture and the history of America and the contributions of African Americans in this country. But as we begin today, I want to introduce our esteemed president of the university, President Mong, and he will be speaking with you right now. Come on, sir.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know, Christopher Marshall is the SGA Vice President, very active on campus. Thank you for doing this today, Chris. It means a lot to us. I want to welcome everybody. I would especially welcome Dr. Wright, taking time out of his busy teaching schedule at Texas A&M to come down. And this morning, we had the pleasure of listening to him engage over 100 students at Gillum Collegiate Academy just around the corner. And don't mean to embarrass him, but he had their attention the whole time for an hour. And they asked good questions, and he had good answers. So I think we're going to look forward to a wonderful time with him today. So again, thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for being here. And I'd like to ask Dr. Monica Williams, who worked with Dr. Wright for many years at Prairie View, to come up and introduce him. And the two of them, I think, is a mutual respect society. So, Monica, it's all yours.
Thank you, President Mong. And it is afternoon, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. George Carlton Wright. Dr. Wright and I did work together at Prairie View. He hired me, took a chance on me, gave me my first big job in higher education, and for that I could not be more grateful. He has been a mentor, he's been a friend, and he's been one of the best bosses I ever had. I would just like to say, when I thought about Black History Month and how we could invite speakers here, President Mong and I had multiple dialogues around, who can we invite to come? And he said, I would just love to have George Wright come and greet our students and faculty and staff. And do you think he would come? I said, well, we could see. Well, at that time, he was the president at Prairie View still, and when he decided that he would return to the classroom after 14 years, we gave him a call and said, would you come? And he graciously agreed to come this February. So we're so glad to have him. It's been quite refreshing to have constant communication with him over the last couple of months since we've been planning for this event, because he's a jokester. He likes to crack jokes. He calls himself corny, but in the long run, he has just such a remarkable story, one that is really very much like our students here. He wasn't an AB student in school, and I hope he'll tell you a little bit about that, but he went on to get, as a C+D student, to get a PhD from Duke University. And that's no small potatoes. He also grew up in the projects a little bit for a time, and he's doing some amazing things now that he's left the presidency at Prairie View, and I just couldn't be more pleased. I'll leave you with this. The one thing he always told me, and I tell him even now, that I'm trying to embrace, and that is, if you own time, you late. So that stuck with me forever, and I just appreciate his support of me and for being here today. And without further ado, Dr. Wright, would you like to come up?
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, it is indeed an honor to be here. And before I go any further, I was hoping, and it has turned out this way, that in the back over here is representative, and I realized that she's retired from that, Helen Giddings. But during the 14 years that I served as president of Prairie View, she was a person that I went to repeatedly. And even though she had her own constituencies here, were it not for her, a lot of the things that Prairie View and Texas Southern have, we would not have, including the most important thing that when I started there, Prairie View and Texas Southern were receiving $12.5 million a year, or a total of 25 for biennial, money for 6 years. But that money was to run out, and every 2 years we worked to have that extended. Well, thanks to Helen Giddings and Sylvester Turner and Senator West and then others, that money is now permanent in their budgets in that regard. And so So I want to say that, and since Dr. Williams mentioned my background, this program is not about me. I will say this, but and I do think that we could use anyone in this room or anyone else's personal story to illustrate just what can happen and maybe hopefully inspire folk. I have always been a person who loved to read, and I'll probably mention that. And so reading has always been one of the cornerstones of my life. And I didn't realize how much it would help me later on. But when I was 15 years old, something that a lot of you can relate to, my father had become an alcoholic, and he walked out on my mother and I was one of 6 children. And it also coincided with my going to predominantly white schools for the first time. And I was completely angry at the world, and I just would not go to school most days, and I was ashamed and so forth. And so in high school, I never made an A, never really made a B. I made C's and D's. And then one of the most tragic incidents in American history happened. Martin Luther King was assassinated 2 months before I was to graduate from high school. And the University of Kentucky, as did 15, 20 other universities across the country, had a special program for black students. Today, they would have a program that would involve folk of lower socioeconomic, regardless of race. That would also mean white students, Mexican American students, Asian American students, African American students. But in that context and time, it meant black students. And they said if you would come to the University of Kentucky for 6 weeks and take simulated college classes, they'd give you a Martin Luther King scholarship as long as you maintained a B. I had never made a B. I had that scholarship for 4 years, and then they gave me another one, and then Duke University was trying to open its doors, and they said they would give me and others a fellowship. To go to Duke back then would be the equivalent of today. It cost $40,000 in tuition, and Duke said they could only give me the money for 3 years, but it would take 4 years to get a PhD. And I have never been smart, but I was able to get my PhD from Duke in 3 years. And so at age 27, I had a PhD from Duke. And what I would like to say to folk, it opened up a door so wide that in 2 weeks, when I turned 69, new opportunities are still coming my way. When I started teaching at the University of Texas, after all these things, students told me I was smart. And you know, if enough folk tell you something, you say, it's got to be true, right? It just must. I called my mother, and I said, Mama, these folks say I'm smart. She said, I loved you when nobody else seemed to be in your corner. This, that, and so forth. You can't even cut up a chicken. You're not so smart in that regard. So I am here to tell all of you, whatever your aspirations are, it can be achieved. And if folk tell you have to be smart, say you met a person who's been a college president, who's been this, who's been that, and he is not smart. The brother all he can do, he knows a little history and so forth. He's had two things, the ability to work hard, and God has answered his prayers, okay? That's the two things I've had. Okay, so enough about me. What I want to do is two things. I want to talk about why Black History Month today is still important. And then second, I want to talk about the national theme of Black History Month, which is on migration. Okay. I'm not going to assume that everyone in this room, like me, has been attending Black History Month programs all of their lives. But in 1956, first grade, I went to a Black History Month program at my school, Booker T. Washington School. I don't know how much I enjoyed that program, but after a while, it got to the point where I kind of liked being out of class and going to programs and things like that. But at some point, they made me learn some poems, for heaven's sakes, and then they made me participate, and I had to even learn songs and all of that. So that didn't thrill me back then. I didn't know it was planting a seed. When I was a senior at the University of Kentucky, a local church called me about 3 days before they were scheduled to have their program and said someone couldn't make it. Would I come? I was a substitute in that regard. But since 1972 till the present, I have given a talk for Black History Month, and I've been attending Black History Month programs since 1956. It is an honor for me to do this, and I get something out of doing this. That said, I've been around long enough to know that not everyone has the same enthusiasm for Black History Month that I do. In fact, I've even had some people, regardless of age, race, whatever, say to me, is Black History Month still necessary? Some people have said, I thought the goal was integration, yet you're reminding us of blacks being specific in a certain way. And I've tried to, first of all, I said, well, heck, we took February, the shortest month, right? We left all these other months in that regard. And I try to point out in my own way, I said, well, we also do Mexican American History Month, Women's History Month, Asian History Month. And before you say we don't do White History Month, I assume all the other months are White History Month. We just don't call it that. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with White History Month. I don't have a problem with months in that regard. Is Black History Month still necessary? What do we gain from Black History Month? For me, a scholar, I think it's important to look at why it started. 1915, Carter G. Woodson started, and I truly don't know, did he call it Negro History Hour, Negro History a few minutes, Negro History Day, or something like that, which eventually became Negro History Week, then Black History Month. If you know anything about 1915 America, it is during the lowest point of race relations that black people in Texas, in Kentucky, in Mississippi, in Indiana were segregated to the fullest extent of white people's imagination. In many of these states, they would testify in court. A black person would swear on a Bible that was black, a white person on a white Bible. Schools, of course, parks, of course, and so on. But segregation was not the only thing. It was backed by, quote, scientific scholars in sociology and history writing books like The Negro a Beast, The Negro a Menace to American Society, The Passing of the Great Race, a book on eugenics written in the United States that people in Germany said, this makes a lot of sense. That in other words, some of the people who would do some atrocious things elsewhere adopted some ideas that were floating around in the United States during that time. During that period, according to Tuskegee Institute records, the Chicago Tribune records and so forth, from 1882 to 1930, almost 5,000 people were lynched during this time. 75% of the victims were African Americans. If you do the math, it means someone was lynched almost every other day in the United States over that period, often in carnival-like atmospheres. The people who wanted to do something to change this thought that Black History Day, week, month was one thing that might help. First of all, there were whites involved. A number of Jewish leaders, a number of white leaders came together with W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, and others. They founded the NAACP, but through that in its crisis, they most definitely promoted Black History Month. Carter G. Woodson went to great lengths to explain to folk that from the moment that explorers came to these shores, there were Black people involved. They made that contribution. Carter G. Woodson said, take any war, including the war that they were about to go into, World War I, or the Great War, that Black people had made a contribution in those wars. Then they talked about Black institutions, Black businesses, all sorts of things that Black people were doing at that time. They would continue to do that during Black History Month. Don't know about you, but in addition to reading, Black History Month would be one of the reasons why I became so interested in history. I said I wasn't going to say anything else about myself, but I guess I'm about to deviate from that. In the 5th grade, cutting up in school, right, which was common for me, the teacher said I could not go out for lunch. Okay, I'm a recreation after lunch. But back then, you cannot just have a kid in the room by him or herself. They said I had to go to the library. Okay. I go to the library sulking, right? Mad, sit there for 5 minutes or so, but I got an hour to be there. And because I loved history, I gravitated toward the books on Christopher Columbus and so forth. Then all of a sudden, I come upon a book that has illustrations of something I'm not really aware of. It turns out to be that this book is on slavery in the New World, primarily in Brazil. But what really stands out to me, they show a Black woman with an iron cage or iron mask over her face. I mean, I'm in the 5th grade, I see this, it's burned into my mind. 5 years ago, my wife and I are in the African American Museum in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And I walk up on something and I see this illustration, probably 16 by 20. And I said, that's that woman. I saw that 50 some years ago through Black History Month. I'll pass this around. I only brought one copy of it. If you really want a copy, I can give it to you later, but I'll give it back. But look at this. This is something that just captivated or horrified me, but it was part of what Black History Month opened up to me in that regard. So Black History Month started back then and would be very, very important. Okay. Every year, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History come up with a theme for Black History Month. They've done things on Black businesses. They've done things on Black education. This year's theme is on migration. For all I know, they may have looked at what our country is debating right now and decided the whole issue of immigration. I don't know whether that's what made them decide on that or what. But the national theme this year is on migration, the movement of Afro-American people. They talk a lot about it internally, to where you look at a community like Dallas that did not always exist in the same manner or anywhere else. when I think about the topic of black migration, I just want to make some comments to you in two ways. There's probably a lot of other ways one could do it, but two ways. One, I think about the migration of people of African descent that started in the 1500s and would continue almost without stop for 350 years. Some people often call it the African diaspora. Those of us in this room who are descendants of people who were slaves, we had relatives in the African diaspora. The forced migration from Africa would be the largest movement of people in the history of mankind by force. And some of you, of course, are very familiar with how that took place. I'm sure it's nice to be talking with some folk who are my contemporaries, not to say that all of you are my age, but when I ask my students at the universities, have you ever heard of Roots, Kunta Kinte, Kizzy, they look at me like, what is he? He's making stuff up? Well, I tell folk, you all don't remember when that came out in 1976, and it shows us, recall, this is what happened to some of our ancestors. The very first time I went to South Africa, I went with Sylvester Turner and Helen Giddings. And actually, I have a photograph. I got lots of them there. But one of the photographs I so love is of what became my favorite animal, the wildebeest. Well, the wildebeest that I took a photo of, you can see him, but there's high brush all around him. I call him George in that regard. Well, in any event, you then turn back in 30 seconds, you can't see him because of this high brush. Kunta Kinte goes out by himself to get some wood to make an instrument for a gift for someone. He's out there in the brush by himself, and all of a sudden it becomes quiet. Look at this. That's not good in the African bush, right? But be this quiet. He then realizes there's some folk looking at him. It turns out to be 6 people, according to Alex Haley. And all of a sudden, the brother takes off. Boom, he's running. But you know what happens? He gets into this open area. 6 of them get around him. Kunta, being a hero, takes a knife, kills one of them. But there's still 5 of them, and one of them throws a net on him. And every time I've seen that, and Hollywood slows it down, I say, goodbye, Africa, hello, America. Okay, he's captured. But more than that, we now know that what happened, people in French-built ships, Portuguese-built ships, and so forth, that these shippers went to the west coast of Africa, and they contracted with various African nations, and they would go 300 to 400 miles into the interior, and they would raid a village of 50 to 100 people. Late at night, they would capture about 2/3 of them. Someone my age, they would look at me and say, we don't need him to go. They just go ahead and knife me out. I'm gone. But they would take the rest of the people, and these folk would then be part of this long voyage to the west coast of Africa, then the Middle Passage, and then they would end up in America. Some 80 million people over 350 years were in these African villages and so forth, to where some 15 to 20 million make it alive in what would become the New World. That you see, death and destruction is all part of the way. So the first migration is that occurs, and it led to us coming to the New World. In reality, most people did not come to the United States. Only 10% maximum came to what became the United States. 45 to 50% went to Brazil, then to other places and the like in that regard. Okay. These African people brought with them work skills. They brought cattle herding techniques. They brought rice cultivation techniques. And the reason, and I'm saying this in parenthesis, so if anybody quotes me on this, understand I'm saying this to make a point. The reason they made, quote, good slaves, I didn't say they wanted to be slaves or they enjoyed being slaves or they accepted being slaves. What these people brought with them was also an immunity to both European and Asian diseases, where whites and Native Americans died out by the thousands. These Africans had an immunity to malaria and yellow fever. The sickle cell trait led as much as anything to folk becoming slaves in that sense, which of course is not a good trait, is not a good thing to have then, but in 1600 America, it was a good thing to have. So the first migration is there. Interestingly, this first, one of the first internal migrations occurs at the time of the American Revolutionary War. It's hard for us to think about the British as the good guys in the American Revolution. I understand that. But think about this. When the American Revolutionary War breaks out, England says if any slave joins His Majesty's forces, he would be given his freedom. George Washington and the Patriots say, we will not allow them to fight because if you, a white person, joins, you will be given slaves for having fought in the war. So you see, it's the British who many black people rush to. To be sure, there are some who are compelled to help them, what becomes the Americans. But when the British lose the war, 1783, they are leaving. The British hold out for 15,000 African slaves to go with them. They would take these people to Toronto, to Halifax, and so forth. I have been the last 2 summers to Toronto, to St. John's, Newfoundland, and then to places in Halifax. And in Nova Scotia, there would be 30 communities of black folk who had been enslaved in this country who become free, and they actually have homecoming celebrations now there. So one of the first migrations would occur right after the American Revolutionary War, and it would be blacks moving to Canada, a haven. And as long as slavery existed, of course, Canada would be a haven, would be a resting point, would be a place that black people go to. But the second part of black migration occurs after or beginning with the Civil War. The outbreak of the Civil War even though the Union Army initially says it is not a war of emancipation, it's a war of secession. As you know, recall your 8th grade, 11th grade college courses, Lincoln says he would not free the slaves. France and Great Britain are on the sideline, and they say to the Confederacy, we will guarantee you victory if you do one thing, free your slaves. The Confederacy says that's what the war is about. Lincoln, now realizing that if he's going to have a chance to win this war, he's got to keep them on the side plus change public opinion. The Confederate Army then invades Maryland, and a major battle occurs August 1862 in a place called Antietam, Maryland. Robert E. Lee is defeated. Abraham Lincoln issues his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation saying that as of January the 1st, 1863, all of the slaves in the rebelling states only will be free, and blacks can be used as soldiers. This would be the critical turning point of the Civil War. It would interject 185,000 black men fighting in the Civil War. Bear in mind that 1 out of 12 white men who fought in the American Civil War sustained an injury or death. That's incredibly high. 1 out of 3 black men who fought in the Civil War sustained an injury or death. If 1 out of 12 is high, what is 1 out of 3 in that regard? Just shows you the price black people paid for the Civil War in that regard. But black people started using the preliminary and then the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves only in the rebelling states to gain their freedom. Since all of you have read my books on race relations in Kentucky, thank you for that. I've written 3 books on race relations in Kentucky, and it's like I wrote something that is a secret, right? That folk have not read those. But one of my books talks about slavery ending last in Kentucky 6 months after the Civil War, right? That's where slavery ends last. But it is the Civil War that really increases black migration. First of all, black people started doing something that white people call aimless wandering. What does that mean? These folks started leaving the rural South, and this, quote, aimless wandering were attempts by them to reunite with members of their family. Think about being here in Dallas or Dallas area, 1855, and a loved one had been sold away. 1865 now. How are you going to find that person? But they spent the rest of their lives going all over trying to reconnect with family members. It was not aimless wandering. It's also a measure to show that they were free, that people started moving around. Whether we're talking Dallas, Houston, Austin, pick anywhere else, you then see the start of black communities, not often in the center of a Dallas, but you see on the outskirts, black communities starting. The years after the war would also lead to some blacks in places like Texas leaving because of violence and going to places like Oklahoma. You see the start of all black towns in a place like Oklahoma that would exist up until the 1920s, when some of the famous of these towns were destroyed because of race riots in that context. So you see black migration then where I started by talking about this horrible period of race relations would lead to blacks leaving the South, definitely the rural South, living only in a Dallas or Houston, and then moving to border states, an Ohio, a Virginia, a Kentucky, and so forth. And then later, of course, during World War I, they would start moving to Indianapolis, Chicago, and above all, New York City in that regard. So black migration after the Civil War would increase. Interestingly, there were some people in the 1890s who also said black people should, quote, quit America, unquote. And you do see a handful, not a lot, but a handful of blacks going, quote, back to Africa, to places like Liberia to live. The World War I years would accelerate. Again, when industrial jobs opened up, you see blacks migrating northward. Interestingly, if you've ever been to Berlin, Germany, Paris, France, London, Vienna, Austria, during those years, there were black soldiers who ended up stationed in some of those places, either before or after the war. Some of them said, I'm never going back to America. So there would be pockets in those places and international migration after that. A lot of us, and I realize I'm generalizing, are products of the Great Depression, World War II migration. As president of Prairie View, I have met so many of our alums whose relatives moved to the West Coast. So there would be West Coast migration, and that would continue for decades as long as segregation exists, but more would be moving to the North. But interestingly, when you come to the civil rights movement, by then there are black people in sufficient number in a Dallas, in a Houston, in a Birmingham, and other places to where they launch the protest that would be the modern day civil rights movement. by and large, the modern day civil rights movement among blacks, which starts really in the 1930s, would reach its peak in the 1950s and 1960s, would be an urban phenomena, that blacks in an urban environment own businesses. They have churches, they have colleges, they have an infrastructure, they have numbers to where they can better protest than folk in a rural environment. So it is the migration of blacks to an urban environment that would play a key role in the civil rights movement. Whenever I've given a presentation for Black History Month, I feel compelled to always end by giving my view on where we are. And I understand by saying my view that other people can have other perspectives and they are equally as right as I am. But if you think about what's happened over the last 15, 20 years, you think about the 50th anniversary of Little Rock. You think about the 50th anniversary of the 1964 desegregation. You think about the death of Martin Luther King and other kinds of things. I have often been asked, have things improved? Well, initially, I then went and read what some other people said, and some other people said, no, things had not improved. And I thought about that, and I said, here's what I feel comfortable with. I was born after World War II into a segregated society. In fact, my father and the man who is my father-in-law were drafted into World War II. They didn't see action because they're only like 16, 17. They come back to Lexington after the Second World War, and they cannot try on clothes in downtown Lex. They cannot do things that German prisoners of war can do in Kentucky in that regard. I did not get to go to a public library until I'm about 13 years old. I had to go to a bookmobile. My mother, God rest her soul, used to say, why do you always say this? Me showing off. I would say to her when we're in downtown, Mama, and she would get tired of this, what do white people do in bathrooms that we don't do? Just tell me, what is it they do, Mama? Because I can't go in there. They surely must do something different in that regard, right? To this day, on occasion, I will say to my wife, and she gets tired, go ahead and say it, because you always say it. I could be in the fanciest restaurant in Dallas, right? And nobody's paying me any attention, you know, in the sense of any more than they would anybody else. And I'll look around and I'll say, Valerie, what did they think we were going to do in here but eat? That's all you do, right? I mean, am I missing something? You pay all this money to go to, you fill in the blank, place here in doubt. Don't you just eat and talk? What did they think we were going to do in those things? Okay, so I then look at all, and then when I was a kid, last one, they had an amusement park. Dallas had an amusement park too. I know about the State Fair and all that. They had Jarlin Amusement Park in Lexington, Kentucky. When I was a kid, black people could only go twice a summer on Negro Day. I look forward to going on Negro Day. Can you believe that? I'm a black historian. Do you think I would go now on Negro Day? Or something like that, or some day that I might would go on a day where they were putting down some other group than mine to show solidarity with that group. But I look at the world I was born into, and I apologize if it sounds braggadocious. The University of Kentucky has given me every award that a university can give somebody. Honorary doctorate degree, distinguished this and that. If you go online at the university, you'll see a banner of me at the University of Kentucky that's been waving for 15 years. The first time I went on that campus in 1961, folk mocked me and my classmates, saying that we did not belong there. Next year, I will be a distinguished visiting professor for the whole year at the University of Kentucky in that regard. And so I look at all that. And here's what I like to say, and I hope you can understand where I'm coming from. If you look at the world that my parents were born into, the world they were born into, no one white was sent to prison for a crime against a black person in the Americas. You look at where we are today, there are instances that offend all of us. But here's my punchline. Progress has been made along the way. That we're not where we used to be. We're not where I want us to be. But to say that nothing has changed in spite of all, if you give me whatever examples, and I know some examples here in Dallas, and I bet I can top you with some examples somewhere else that are just as horrific, progress has been made. The challenge for us good people is to not let one thing set us back, nor to discourage us. We have to continue to press on. And what I have to believe, people like us who probably are doing a little bit better than other people, we've got to find a way to continuously reach back and help other folk. That's what we're supposed to do. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. We have time for a few questions, and so if you have a question of Dr. Wright, I'll come down and hand you the mic.
Well, hopefully this is an answer or a question with a yes answer to it.
Okay.
Is this presentation recorded in such a way that we can either get copies of it or Facebook or something? Because I want this to be heard by a lot more people than are here today.
You would have to ask them. The only problem is I was doing this and doing that. And if my wife was here, she'd probably say, you know, you split that verb there. You said with and you did like that or something, you know, so. But no, I hope so in that regard, because what you want to do, and let me say this, the comments that I made about myself, if we allowed other people to do the same, they would have similar experiences of what folk, my story is not that unique. My story is consistent with so many people, and what it speaks to folk, and the challenge is, how do we provide opportunities for folk? You see, I apologize. I tell folk that I know God made me a college administrator, a provost, and a president. The reason why is because I came from a background where other people like me don't make it, and because I got in so much trouble, not blaming white folk or anybody, growing up, that almost anything a kid does, I can probably find a way to say, okay, we're going to give you another chance or a third chance or something like that. Because if A&M knew oh Lord, I shouldn't have said A&M because it might be, if A&M knew everything I had done, they'd probably say, you can't be a professor here in that regard, right? And so why can't we give other folk the same chance that I was given is what I'm talking about. That why do we have to, you know, yes, kids, I don't know if you call them bad, I don't know. I guess I was bad. I was loud. I was uncouth and all that stuff, still am, but in that regard. But that's what I'm talking about. How do we see in all these other people the same things we want people to see in us is all I'm talking about in that regard. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, son. Yeah. Well, first of all, again, maybe if someone from a business school was here in my place or something, they may say they do. I don't know if they do or not. What I would argue is that a lot of times we don't know enough about people who were successful in all sorts of things years ago. Like, for instance, if you tell me there's somebody in Dallas who's the first black person to do this in business, I would applaud them, but I'd say, I bet you it's the first one in 50 years or the first one in 35 years or 45 years or something like that. Not taking anything away from the person. That I think what's so fascinating, sir, about the generations before us are the accomplishments they made with so little against such odds against them. And I don't think folk do that. You know what? If more people knew the struggles of other people in that regard, they would just have to say, you mean they overcame that? And not that my complaints aren't real in that regard. So I don't know if folk don't do more than that. But let me tell you something else about entrepreneurship. I probably don't know much about business that probably people in this room, but my mother told me a long time ago, I'm like 13 or 14, I'm working as a baseball official scorekeeper. It's my first job. And she said to me, you do know it's not the money you make that counts, it's the money that you save. And she then said to me that you need to take out a savings bond. Okay, well, guess what? My mother, because of the situation that she was in, she would take out a savings bond, but in 90 days, the earliest that you could cash it in, she would do that. But I started taking out a savings bond, and I apologize, because I said all this at Prairie View, so I'm saying again. I tell folk that I decided the first year I would take out a savings bond that you would deem for $50. Then the next year, $100. Then I got up to $500. And I kind of put them away. And guess what? Now, I got contacted by the government about 4 or 5 years ago and said, you have to start cashing those in. Right? Because they want their money. But I am not lying. I have savings bonds that say $100 on the face that are worth $450. And that kind of thing. So I tell folk, why don't you do that? I tell folk, and you'll just say, well, you did this because you were president or provost. I told folk that the day my daughter was born, I went and opened up a savings account in her name. $25 the first year, $50, $75, $100, up to $500. Now, if she had gone to Harvard, I wouldn't have had enough money. But guess what? That turned out to be like $80,000 to $90,000 in that regard. I don't know anything, but I tell folk, we need to just show folk how to save. Show folk how to have a rainy day. Do you know what? The black folk I know, and maybe I should press and say the poor folk I know, or the average folk, but I said the black folk I know. Do you know what? They're doing all right, but the daggone refrigerator goes out. The air conditioner, don't the air conditioner go out in the summer, right? The heater goes out in the winter. Why won't it go out the other time? I mean, it's just not right to do folk like that, right? It's almost like it's a trick out there. So guess what happens? They end up being in debt in that regard. And lo and behold, last year, I got a dose of what people have to endure. You all have heard of Hurricane Harvey, right? I lived in one of those neighborhoods in Houston where they decided that they were concerned about folk in downtown Houston. I should have been living down there. So they opened up the reservoir to save them, and I got an inch of water. Now, I've been living in Texas all these years. I just said, it was gone the next day. I said, not bad, we'll be all right. The person comes and says, no, we got to tear out your whole downstairs. I said, no, it costs $250,000. Guess what? I got married when I was 19 years old, and my wife takes care of making sure we pay the bills. She bought national flood insurance every year. I didn't even know that. We had flood insurance. Do you know how much of a headache I had last year? And we had money. I was able to rebuild my house before I got the money from these folk, and then the bank held my money once I got it, even though I already paid for it. So what did poor folk do last year? What these folk in Houston, they're just, these folk who are out on the street, they're just lazy, ornery, no good? No. Those folk just so happen they're living a little bit closer to the edge, and anything moves them over. My point is, how do you help folks save for the rain? How do you save? That wasn't a rainy day, it was a flood. How do you save for the flood in that regard. So it's more than you asked for, but the deal is we got to help people understand you got to find a way to, as hard as it is, save something for this rain that is going to come in that regard. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Judith Osegueda. I like to work with youth, so I would ask that you give me the best advice that I could give a 13-year-old that is considered at risk, I would say challenged, to kind of guide them to move forward.
You know what? If I could help young people, I would say to them, they need to trust somebody who's older than them. It can be a parent, that's easy. It can be a minister, it can be a school teacher, it may even be an older sister and brother, but they've got to have somebody they can tell everything to. They've got to do that. They've also got to know when somebody tells them no, they can't do something. If you've always tried to tell them yes, but then you say no, you can't do that, they've got to come to that realization that a no from you is actually more important than a yes from you, because you're working in their best interest in that regard. And what if you could say to young people, I tell you what, and I really do mean this, I hope I've said something that's made you smile, but I have never once been a professor since 1977, said to students that I'm smarter than them, that I've done things that they can't do. I say the exact opposite. I tell folk, anything I've done, you can do. In fact, I say the one problem with getting to know me, the longer you get to know me, you're going to be less impressed with me, right? So you're going to say, gee, I can do everything his brother can do. He's not that smart. His mama was right in that regard. Why can't you, what is wrong with telling people they can be anything they want? And young lady, this against this backdrop, I believe, you all can say I'm naive, whatever you tell me that you are, black, white, male, Jewish, Gentile, Muslim, gay, straight, whatever you tell me you are, I will say, I believe there are instances when being what you are, white, male, whatever, is an advantage, it's a disadvantage, right? That being black in my life, I gave you examples of being a disadvantage. Being black got me in the University of Kentucky, right? Jeez, I mean, come on, you all. They let folk at UK in with a D average back then? No, they did not. Let a brother in that regard, right? Isn't that an advantage? Come on, you all. In that regard. So I try to tell folk, why don't you accept whatever you are? It would be so much better. It would be so much better if George Wright was 6'5", suave, handsome, right? That would have been good. But instead, why don't I just try to make the best I can? And that there was a reason why I was made like I was. You know, have you all ever told folk, I tell my students all the time, I said, you know what, I have never seen an ugly human being. I tell folk, I've seen a beautiful human being. I married her 48 years ago. I'm clear on that. But I've never seen an ugly person. All of you all are beautiful to me, is what I tell students. And you know what? At my university, I'm trying to look around. I can't half see. When I was president of Prairie View, I would take pictures with students. Some of them would come up with green hair, and I said, I love green hair. Next one, orange. I love orange hair. Next one, this hair, that hair, whatever. Guess what? You can change your hair, right? That hair stuff. Look, I used to even have hair. Look at that. It is no big deal with hair. Or so. Why don't you tell young folk that however they look all right, right? Because we look just as, if it's good or bad, whichever way you want to look at it. And my whole thing is, we need to let them know that we were just like them and that we made. And I tell them all the time, man, I'm the only one in this room who's scared, right? Rest of y'all not scared? I tell them I'm scared to death. When I walked in here today, I said, please, Lord, let me do this little lecture and these folk don't run out and tell A&M I messed up and they get rid of me. Lord have mercy. I said, don't you all would rather have a professor who's willing to acknowledge that he might be a little vulnerable than somebody, I'm the best professor A&M ever had? Not true. That is not true. That is not true. So that's what I try. I try to show young people there is no difference between them and me. I tell them the only difference between them and me is that I am older And in my one little area of history, doesn't it make sense that I've read a few more books? If I've been reading books since I was 4 and I'm now 68, I should have read more books than somebody who's 18. Doesn't that make sense? It didn't say I did a better job of reading the books than them. And there we go. So that's what I try to do. And I think we all have got to find a way to help somebody. I tell you what, when I finally realized that God had opened up a world to me, I told you all earlier about getting to go living in a housing project and all this other stuff. I always wanted to travel. Check this out. On one occasion, I was in a group like this and I said, I've been all over the world. And my wife said, oh, you lied. You have not been all over the world. So I prefaced it by saying I've not been to Madagascar. I've not been to Papua New Guinea. I've not been to Antarctica, not been to Mount Everest, not been to India. Pretty much after that, everywhere I wanted to go, I've been, and I've been 3 or 4 times. This time last month, I was in Melbourne, Australia for the 5th time. I've been to China 10 times, been to Germany 20 times. No exaggeration, my wife and I allow me to lie. And I tell folk, I've got a chance to do all the things I wanted to do in this world. Why did God do that for me? It's so that I could tell other people and say, you can do all the things you wanted to do in that regard. And so we have to find a way to help other folk. I don't know if you all have figured out your calling. My calling, as much as I love young people, I love old folk. I'm a senior citizen who wants to work with senior citizens. Check that out in that regard. I don't like how folk go to Social Security, to government agencies, and folk treat them unkindly. When I go and they're treating me all right, if I see them say something unkind, I have a fit and I act up for these folk there. And I will not allow a senior citizen to do that. But I need to move it to a level where I spend time and go get medicines for senior citizens. I need to spend the time where I spend time helping them on a computer, because it's almost like everything's designed to be difficult to certain folk. And that I guarantee you, I understand if a senior citizen needs somebody to wash their dishes or cut their grass or something, that's what we're supposed to do. And all of that kind of thing. So I would say, if you've been blessed, like I just said, I've been blessed, then God is saying, what are you doing about that? Are you helping young folk? Are you helping seniors? You could help folk in the middle too. But I think those 2 groups of folk, we really are supposed to help. And for me, I love senior citizens in that regard. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to Dallas, spending time at Gillum, spending time at UNT Dallas, and he's about to head out to our law school in downtown Dallas and talk to them. So it's been a full day, and it's been a very meaningful day. What I said at Gillum this morning was I saw and heard Dr. Wright in Houston a few years ago at the Texas Philosophical Society, and there were a lot of famous educators from all over the world who came in to talk about their research. But the talk that I found most meaningful, and I think those of you who heard him today understand why I felt this way, Dr. Wright's talk was the one that I carried with me when I left there. And when Monica and I were talking about someone we would most like to come for Black History Month, we both said George Wright, Dr. George Wright would be our choice. So thank you so much again for coming, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.